and fill the paper with the message that it wants to send.
Welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review Writer's Room. I'm Liz Booker. As pilots, we operate in a world that for us involves almost endless and fascinating technical detail. And as writers, if we're not writing technical manuals, we are all writing to share our world in some way with a broader audience. So, how much of that detail is useful to the reader to have a clear understanding of the setting and circumstances, and how much is too much and will potentially pull the reader out of the story, confuse them, or worse, put them to sleep? Today's discussion on how to find the right balance in incorporating technical detail in our writing will be led by our fellow Aviatrix and author, Robin D. Kardon. This is the second Aviatrix Writers Workshop that Robin has facilitated. You can find her presentation on writing fiction or memoir in the Writer's Room on the Aviatrix Book Review website, but I will reintroduce her for anyone who hasn't met Robin and her work. Before becoming an award-winning author, Robin, writing as R.D. Kardon, had a 12-year flying career as a corporate and airline pilot. She holds an airline transport pilot certificate and 3 captain qualifications. Her travels took her all over the world in every type of airplane, from small single-engine Cessnas to the Boeing 737. And I do believe she's gotten back in the air recently, so congrats for that. I am right behind you. Robin earned a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Sociology from New York University and her law degree from American University, Washington College of Law. A native of New York, Robin lives in San Diego, California with her beloved rescue pets. Her novels Fly Girl and Angel Flight are works of fiction based on her own experience that highlight the challenges women face in aviation. Fly Girl was the Aviatrix Book Club selection for June 2021, and you can find our interview about the book on the Aviatrix Book Review website and podcast. And we anxiously await the third novel in the trilogy. And so before I hand it over to Robin, let's let our other guests introduce themselves and their work or anticipated work, and I'll just start myself. As I said, I'm Liz Booker. I am a retired Coast Guard helicopter pilot, and I am writing contemporary fiction for young adults. Jenny, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Liz. My name is Jennifer Mazeros, and I'm the International Aviation Consultant, normally based in Cambodia for the State Secretariat of Civil Aviation, working on Mekong Lansan cooperation framework projects involving Cambodia, China, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Jenny. And how about you, Laureen?
I'm a retired Navy helicopter pilot. I flew 3 different fleet helicopters, the H-46, H-2, and H-3. And really, it was only after a lot of time had passed that I could look back and reflect and realize what kind of an amazing career I had. Not amazing in that I was some star, but in that I got to do a bunch of cool stuff. And I would like to try to capture some of those early years in the Navy helicopter world in some writing, possibly memoir type.
Well, awesome. Thank you for being here, Laureen. We appreciate it. And Robin, over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's wonderful to have all of you with me today. I am going to present a PowerPoint presentation and discussion called Taming the Tech, how to incorporate technical details without losing the reader. I would like this to be an interactive presentation. I am going to set the stage for everyone, talk about some issues that are important to incorporating technical details. Now, I write fiction, so I anticipate that my work is going to be read by people both in and out of the aviation community. People in the aviation community would understand the technical details that I might write, but people outside would not. And also, I write about topics on which I am not expert. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you approach those topics as well. So it's not just about writing in aviation. I'm going to begin my slideshow by sharing my screen. Liz did a great introduction and honed over time. It's really it's really gotten, quite succinct and crisp, Liz. I think, what is this, like the 27th time you've introduced me?
And
So
I
thank-
get to do it more. I get to do
Thank
it at the Women in Aviation conference. So
Yeah, really.
I'll
Well,
get more practice.
do the one you did today, because it was really superb, and I truly appreciate the effort. For those of you who don't know me, but I think we've all met before on previous Zooms, this is my contact information. If you'd like a copy of this presentation for your personal use only, because this is an original copyrighted work, you feel free to email me and I would be delighted to send it to you. Who am I? I don't have to tell you anymore because Liz did a terrific introduction. But I have done a few things over the years, and I have technical expertise in a variety of different areas. Perhaps the two most significant are aviation and the law. My goal when I give this presentation to any writer is, if you're stuck, maybe give you a way forward, make you think about your writing in a different way, or hopefully uncover at least one new idea to try. If the topic falls flat for you, but you walk away with something you hadn't thought of before, I feel like my job is done. I can tell you from experience that as someone who's struggling, particularly right now with my third novel, which is the hardest one I've written so far, I never know where the idea is going to come from. They always come, but you never know where it's going to come from. So I would be thrilled if whatever idea you're looking for comes from this presentation today. Just to briefly say what this presentation is not, it's not a guide on how to write a novel. I'm not going to teach any of you here anything about aviation you don't already know. And it's not a primer on publishing your manuscript. So one of my favorite articles when I was researching this presentation was One Simple Rule to Avoid Technical Details Ruining Your Story by Robert Woods. And I love this quote: "Technical details work when they feel true within the world of the story. It is their resonance within the created world that makes them effective, not their connection to the world the reader inhabits." People read to be taken away. People don't want to read, pardon me for making an assumption, but I've got to believe that when Liz sits down to read a new book, she doesn't want to read about her life. She doesn't want to read about what Liz Booker had for breakfast that morning. She wants to be taken somewhere else and told a story. That's what we do. We're storytellers, right? And he goes on to say, the truth about including technical detail is that what feels real sometimes differs from what is real. In a work of fiction, the reader cares more about their perception than actual reality. In other words, the reader is going to overlay their understanding of the world on the story that you tell them. They will read that story through their own filter. They will not continue to read their book if they don't feel that your book, if they don't feel that they're being engaged. And if you use a lot of technical detail, you're going to knock them out. So have you, as a writer, made the reader believe? Which of these statements do you think feels more comfortable to a reader? Clearance delivery assigned an airplane eating time of 21:30 Zulu. Or, Tris checked her watch and sighed heavily. The aircraft would be stuck on the ground in Boston for another 4 hours due to the heavy fog. She'd have to call Rex and cancel their date. That is actually an excerpt from my third novel. In the first draft, to get through it, I just put clearance delivery assigned an the airplane and eating time, because I know what that is. That was like a placeholder for me, but then I went back and rewrote it for the reader. So I think it's pretty obvious which one the reader would relate to more. So technical details are important. As you know, I'm a professional pilot who writes about pilots. John Grisham is a lawyer who writes legal thrillers. A woman named Barbara Shapiro, she's an art expert. She writes about the art world. Helen Starbuck is a former nurse who writes about the medical industry. And everyone who's ever been a police officer or a crime reporter writes a crime novel, right? Are you the expert when you're writing Or are you just building enough expertise to make your readers believe? So, Jennifer, you write about aviation?
Yes, that's correct. I
And-
work, yes, across ICAO audit results.
Well,
So,
so which are very technical.
Yeah.
Which are very technical. And Laureen, I know you mentioned that you're a Navy helicopter pilot. If you were to sit and write your story, obviously, you know, there would be some technical details. So in your case, you would have to ask yourself, you know, like Jennifer has to ask herself. Liz has already said her audience is young adults. My audience are adults who read fiction. Laureen, you'd have to ask yourself, who's my audience? Am I writing this book for my family? Am I writing it for other pilots? Because you will write the technical details differently depending on who your audience is. If it's for general consumption, you know, you're not going to be able to be as technical as you might be with everyone on this call. So you have to understand where you're coming from. What do you know and what don't you know? Okay, so the example I like to use, and you'll hear this a few times, is there was some police procedures that I had to write about in my second book. And we'll talk a little bit in detail about how I went about doing that. But I had to do research there that, you know, I wanted to write about police procedures. You know, I'm a Law and Order fan from way back. I've seen every episode 675 times, you know, all of the different iterations. So I wanted to write about police procedure, but I wanted to be an honest broker. I didn't want to make something up that I could have checked to see what was real. I can make up a character, I can make up their life, but I was writing about police procedure in Bangor, Maine, and there is a Bangor, Maine, and there is a police department there. You know, I had the opportunity to learn the true details. So what can you do if you want to write about something that you don't know about? There are an endless list of resources, social media, local organizations. If anybody wanted any information about the catalog of books about women in aviation written by women in aviation, they would go to our very own Liz Booker, who has made herself through her efforts an expert on the topic. You'd go to local organizations, girls that are interested in aviation here in San Diego, go to the San Diego chapter of Women in Aviation, affinity groups like us, public service like the police, or any, you know, Facebook groups are amazing for finding details. There is no excuse for getting it wrong, in other words. I mean, back in the day when details weren't at our fingertips like they are now on the internet, you know, there was a little bit more literary license, but these days there's simply no excuse for getting it wrong. So, can you use technical detail to bring your reader into the story? And yes, you can. There are a number of different techniques, and I combine them. The first area I call setting and the senses. The second I call character and dialogue. So setting, isn't that a great picture? And I chose that specifically because in one of my books, the setting is a mountainous area. Ask yourself, what do you want the reader to know? First of all, be clear and concise. Don't over-explain. As you heard in every writing class you've ever taken and from every writer you've ever known, show, don't tell. Bring the reader there. Don't say, you know, it was a beautiful sunny day. You know, you can also say, you know, the sun was high in the sky, it bounced off the snow, it blinded Tris without her sunglasses, or your main character. Use actions, sounds, and smells. And I'm going to read you an example from Fly Girl. Tris finished her duties early. It gave her some time before the maintenance crew pushed the Astral out of the hangar to treat herself to a few minutes alone on the ramp, just to watch the show. Airplanes executed precise turns and revolutions, taxiing in step with the choreography designed by ground control. Aviation equivalents of stop and yield signs kept them from harm as they traversed the blue, yellow, and white pathways on taxiways and runways. Other airplanes rose in rhythm to the takeoff commands of tower controllers. Tris closed her eyes to identify the manufacturer of aircraft engines from the sound they made on takeoff. She inhaled deeply. She counted off the seconds in her head until she heard the gear come up once airborne, felt the split-second timing of planned positioning, the canon of aircraft movement at the airport, the only true ballet. Action, sights, sounds, smells, everything but touch. Now, that, there were some technical terms used, taxi, taxiway, runway, but they're the types of terms that the traveling public would certainly understand, right? And do any of you think that someone who didn't have an aviation background would not understand what that passage was trying to convey? Right.
So it
So
was very clear. And the one thing I'll add to that, Robin, that you used in there were metaphors that were relatable to the general public, relating the aircraft signage to road signs. So
yeah, that I like to read that passage because that was the passage that Kirkus, which is a fairly well-known review organization, used in its review of the book. So I want to just take a minute for any of you that may ultimately, any of you here on the call or any of you who are listening to the recording, you may want to write like an urban fantasy book or some type of magical realism. And I want to distinguish setting versus world building. Setting is a story or scene or where the book takes place, and we give them similar attributes of other locations on the planet. There's a particular set of assumptions we make about them. We understand that the characters are human beings and they interact with their environment by being on the ground due to gravity, and there are no, vampires generally. You never know. There's no undead, no zombies, and not to put that type of writing down because it's extremely popular. But a setting is something that we can relate to as being of our world. World building can be that, but it can, there are no limits when you build a story world that is not real. One of the things I always tell people who want to write urban fantasy or magical realism is, horror fiction, which sometimes is not very realistic. You got to educate the reader on what the norms and the customs are of your story world, because they will not be obvious to the reader. Now, I want to make it clear that we are not discussing world building in this course. First of all, I'm not qualified to do it. And we don't have the week that it would take. So if you are interested in world building, there are many, many organizations that offer courses, geared directly toward that. Character is expert. So how do you establish your character as an expert? You might use their physical description or interaction with other characters. And as an example of that, reading from Angel Flight, Tris busied herself brushing crumbs off the seats and collecting trash. She crossed the seat belts, made sure all the seats were forward and tray tables stowed. The rug needed a quick vacuum. Tris grabbed the full bag of trash and went to request a shop vac. She ran into the bearded ramper she hadn't recognized before. She smiled and held out her hand. Hey, we haven't met. Tris Miles. I remember you. He touched her hand quickly and turned away. Wait, what? You do? Have we met? Yep. You came in here a couple of times in an Astral. He laughed and jabbed his thumb toward the Royal. That little prop you ride now? She was used to being looked down on by other pilots who flew bigger, more sophisticated aircraft, but a ramper? As he turned away again, she called after him, I need a vacuum and a lav service. He kept walking. Now. He smirked. You sure that's what the captain wants? Despite the cold, Tris hadn't yet put on her parka, so she rotated the sleeve on her uniform jacket so he could see her epaulets. I am sure, she said evenly. He looked at the 4 stripes and shook his head. Yes, Captain. So I've established, now I've done this earlier in the book. This is page 82. The reader knows who she is, but in that setting, she is exercising authority, and I have used a physical attribute and an interaction to establish that authority. So the next way of showing, that a character is an expert is to use dialogue. Let's see. I'll read this example. And it's also a great way, dialogue is also a great way to relate details and educate. Anyone who's done a lot of writing tries to avoid a tremendous amount of exposition, which is explanation without action and without moving the story forward. It's also sometimes called backstory. Because that's when the reader starts to snooze a little bit. We've ruined ourselves as writers. We've gotten readers used to, action, action, action on every page. And now that's what they've come to expect. In this particular case, we have Tris talking to her therapist and trying to explain a bad decision, bad judgment, her own bad judgment as a pilot. And it includes some description of technical detail. You'll see. Tris sat, gulped a few breaths, and closed her eyes, shaking her head back and forth. She leaned forward, arms on her thighs, hands clasped together, and whispered, "I made a series of bad decisions. The error chain." The flying public always looked for pilot error, the one thing a pilot did wrong after an in-flight disaster. But those tragedies were generally the result of multiple faulty judgments, tiny cracks in a flight's foundation, which on their own caused no damage, yet when sequenced one after the other, resulted in catastrophe. Like JFK Jr.'s crash, so many bad choices. So tell me about your decisions and how they created a disaster. Dr. C still didn't get it. No, I mean one more. If I'd made one more bad decision, if there had been, Tris rubbed her hands together, their callous skin scratched like sandpaper. I let Bruce sit in the left seat, the pilot in command seat, on a takeoff out of an airport surrounded by mountains, and he almost flew into one. He almost killed us. So I have educated the reader about something that's extremely important in aviation. It's called the error chain. A series of bad decisions that can be catastrophic. Liz is nodding. Anyone who's flown for a living understands this.
Well, I'm also nodding about the art of what you did in the center of the dialogue like that. I had an advisor in my master's program who was very cautious about, he uses the phrase, it's not mine, it's his, he uses the phrase pause button violation to describe when you're in a dialogue scene and you interrupt the dialogue for this vast exposition, but there are places where it is appropriate, and that is a perfect example. And it's not long, it's very short, it's enough to let us know the context of what she's trying to explain to her therapist. So no, I think it's great.
Thank you. And you're exactly right. Thank you for bringing up that point. I can't tell you how many times my own editors have said, you got to cut this because you can't chop up the dialogue with extended exposition, which is exactly, it's a pause violation, as your instructor mentioned. And that's a really great term. I give him props for that. You have to think about how you're building your character. Are you building your character as someone with knowledge, like Tris, who's a pilot? You got to give them an accurate pedigree. She's a captain. She's type rated. She does all kinds of, piloting command things. Someone who's seeking knowledge. A really great example of this is Hunt for Red October, the Alec Baldwin character. And if any of you haven't seen it, first of all, what are you waiting for? It is like in my top 5 list of movies, and number 2, it is just simply phenomenal. Alec Baldwin is an expert in Soviet submarines, but something new is in the water now. The Soviets have come up with something new that he doesn't know anything about. So he's driven to help the Soviets from blowing up the United States. This is, set in the Cold War, of course, or just after, and driven to learn more about this special submarine. And it is masterful. It is Hunt for Red October. Was that Clancy? Tom Clancy? Yeah, he
Yep.
is masterful at writing technical novels, but he doesn't spare the detail. He includes all of it, whether you know what it is or not. But they really did a superb job in this in the movie Hunt for Red October, in getting the movie watcher, the audience, to understand the story. Or someone who inadvertently gains knowledge they don't want. And I realize I'm dating myself here with this Alfred Hitchcock movie. And in Sorry, Wrong Number, the female protagonist picks up the phone and overhears a conversation where her husband is hiring someone to kill her. And she's, of course, she's physically disabled. And what does she do about it? She spends the whole movie, trying to stay alive. And to find out how she can block this insidious plan. You can also use a narrator. This gets a little detailed. If you are writing in what is called omniscient point of view, where the narrator of the book knows what everybody's thinking and feeling, if this narrator can always say what Beverly didn't know, or what Beverly couldn't see, or what Beverly didn't hear, was that Jim was sneaking up behind her with a knife, and was going to kill her. So that would work very well in an omniscient point of view. There are other ways to use a narrator, but you have to ask yourself, if you're sitting down to write fiction, what is your story's point of view? Who is telling the story? Who is telling the story? I occasionally like to give writing exercises, and I won't ask everyone to do this tonight, but I want to ask you to think about, in the context of what we've just been talking about and how to incorporate technical details, could you, as someone who is not being chased by a murderer, how would you, at this precise moment anyway, how would you write this paragraph? Your character and the man who murdered his family are alone in a room. Your character has a semi-automatic pistol pointed at the man. There is no electricity or window in the room. It's a basement beneath a restaurant. Using setting, observation, dialogue, and the senses, and without using the word gun or the word shoot, write a paragraph in which your character kills the man. So let's think about this setting. He held his hand out of the dark. He smelled he heard the wok crackling on the stove upstairs in the Chinese restaurant. He called out, "Where are you?" He pulled the trigger, and he smelled immediately, got the smell of sulfur in his nose. I mean, there's so many different ways you could do that without resorting to, he picked up the gun, pointed it, and shot. Nobody wants to read that. Okay, well that, it's, they're reading a book, they want to read creative writing, and unless your paragraph isn't about this person being shot, they want to be entertained. So you have to think about how you might write this. Fly Girl includes, I think you've all read it, but if you haven't, Fly Girl includes a pretty tense scene where the pilots are running out of fuel and they have a mechanical problem. It's a landing gear emergency, okay? And in the book, I make the point that they're flying around, they're getting near their destination, and they can't get the landing gear down. They can get 2 wheels come down, the third one doesn't. And in the scene, which is a very pivotal scene in the book, because some other things happen as well, I discuss I have Tris saying to the person who's flying, gear levers down, but I don't have 3 green, I don't have 3 green. And then describing the 3 green lights that indicate that the gear is down and lock did not come on, no 3 green. So from that point on, the reader knows what 3 green means, right? I don't have to explain that again. I described the landing gear lever as basically a stick with a round lollipop on the on the end of it that you pull up and bring down. And I also have a piece of dialogue where the captain says, lower the gear. And Tris says, I can't, we're going too fast. You don't want to rip the gear off, which, tells the reader, again, something that we all know is that if you try and extend the gear beyond a safe landing gear speed, there is a possibility, although not a probability, that you could do some severe structural damage to the airframe. And in the reader wants description, dialogue, and stakes, and I give them description, 3 green lights, landing gear lever, dialogue, I don't have 3 green, don't have 3 green, raising the tension. And the stakes are, they're either going to crash, or if they lower the landing gear at too fast a speed, the gear is going to come off the bottom of the airplane. So that's something to keep in mind. So why did it work? Why did it work in Flygirl? Why did I not have one comment from one reader with, God, over 200 reviews saying I didn't understand the landing gear scene? Because landing gear is something the reader understands. They understand that the landing gear has to come down for the airplane to land. It engages them with the characters whose point of view we're here. We put them right in the cockpit. We explain to them what we're doing in the cockpit in a way they could understand without too much exposition, no pause violations. And it's consistent with reality. And at this point, I always like to say things like, if anybody ever saw the Denzel Washington movie Flight, no one is sitting in the cockpit stone drunk and they're not flying upside down. So, which I'm sure people found entertaining, but at that point I had to switch the thing off because I just couldn't stand it anymore. Now, if we're writing fiction, you got to ask yourself, well, can I just make something up? I mean, am I tied to reality? Of course. You can make up all kinds of things, and I'll give you some examples. To simplify, I created an airplane that doesn't exist. In my novel Flygirl, I created something called an astral. There is no astral. The reason I did that, and this came up interestingly enough during a book club for my book, when someone said, well, why were they all stressed out about, not being able to get 3 green? Couldn't they lower the landing gear manually, which you can do in basically every jet aircraft and most turboprops? The Astral is not a real airplane. It doesn't have that attribute. It has a backup hydraulic system, but it doesn't have, a manual gear extension. And that's one of the reasons I created the Astral, because it needed to have certain characteristics. To engage. So again, as we talked about before, you want to use technical details to take the reader away from the everyday. I mean, other than people on this call and people in the Aviatrix book review and the Aviatrix book club and Aviatrix writers, most people reading it don't fly every day. They're not professional pilots. They want to be in a different world. We put them in a real world situation where the tech is relevant again. And if you're writing fantasy, just as a caveat, things may work differently in your story world. In your story world, airplanes may not need gear to land, but in the real world, they do. All right, when do readers crave all the technical detail they can get, whether they know what it means or not, is crime novels. I'm friendly with a guy named Patrick O'Donnell, which has a very popular Facebook group called Cops and Writers, and he's written 2 books on it. He's a retired Milwaukee Police Department sergeant. He's written Cops and Writers and Cops and Writers, Crime Scenes and Investigations. He also has a podcast, Cops and Writers. And I interviewed, I chatted with him at great length and I've also used his books. He also read Angel Flight for me. He said people are just obsessed with the police. He says he tries to tell authors not to get bogged down in the tech. I mean, if they have a good base and mix in a war story or two, that's what the reader wants to hear. But you know, bullets, what kind of bullet, what was the distance the bullet was fired at, you know, the entry wounds, exit wounds. Oh my goodness. He said readers are just obsessed. If you want, you can screenshot this screen, which has 3 exercises that I actually do myself when I've put in a very technical placeholder, like the paragraph about an edict time, to write a paragraph that fits the story you're telling and just include the technical details, just go to town. Then write the same paragraph using environment and the senses, and then write the same paragraph using dialogue. I can tell you that when I give this course to people outside of aviation, they love these exercises. And usually by the end of them, because they come to the course thinking, how am I ever going to be able to write about my technical area of expertise, stay true to the tech, and get the reader engaged? And they walk away, they're usually, you know, like they've seen the light bulb. They're like, I don't have to just write a whole lot of detail. I can describe it in the way that a lay person would understand it, because I'm a writer and I have that skill. I can write, you know, I can be creative. I can use all of my creativity. So I like these 3. That is the end of my presentation. I want to just give some props. I didn't get to talk about them very much, but before I open it up for questions, I just want to give some props to the Bangor, Maine Police Department. Let me tell you something, just to give you a little example of a mistake I almost made. I'll ask my own question and answer it. When I was writing Angel Flight, again, there's some police involvement on a flight that lands in Bangor, Maine. And there was a shooting, and there were some injured people. And I had written that the SWAT team and paramedics had come on the airplane. Well, I wanted to just make sure, you know, is this what would have happened? So I called the Bangor Police Department, and wouldn't you know it, they had a public information office, which was staffed by a sergeant, Wade Betters. And Sergeant Betters said, no. We don't call them SWAT here. We call them SRT. And by the way, the paramedics are SRT members and they're wearing the same gear. So they don't come later. They come with the SRT. And as a result, I don't think any reader except someone in the Bangor Police Department would have been upset about that. But it was so easy for me to get it right. It was so easy for me to make a phone call. I included some fake news articles from a location up in remote Nunavut, Canada, in Iqaluit. And I did some research and found that there is a newspaper up in Iqaluit called the Nunatsiaq News. And I wrote the articles in their exact format, which I could easily find on the internet. If I hadn't done that, would anyone have noticed? But I would have noticed. And I guess I want to leave you with that. What I started with. There's a way to get it right. There's a plethora of information out there, and we write because we want to be creative and we want to tell a story. And there is no reason that any of us can include the expertise that we've honed over years and years and years and still tell a story that will appeal to the general public. So with all that, I will open it up to the field.
Well, I don't know what questions everyone has, but I will just start by with a few comments. So first of all, I would consider, if I have any expertise in writing, it would be what I did as my critical thesis for a master's degree, which was creating the feeling of movement for a reader. And so I will do a presentation on that at some point. But I see a lot of parallels here where you are building the context for the reader. You have, like the example that you used with the gear emergency. You're giving them just enough information, like detail about the 3 green, about the handle, about the air. You don't even have to say the airspeed limitations. You do it in a creative way, and you let the reader do the rest. So you just give them enough contextual clues and the sense of urgency, the emotional impact of the scene, and then they can kind of build the rest around that. And it's the same thing in building the feelings of movement using active verbs, metaphor, things that people can relate to. And for a writer like me, where I'm writing for young people who maybe don't have as broad a global contextual experience as adults would, I have to really think about how much information they need.
You know what, and not to interrupt, but what I didn't
Yeah.
do is I didn't say she pulled the gear down, which actuated the
No.
system, which
No.
released the gear locks
And the hydraulic PSI is normally
you know, at 3,000 pounds per square.
right.
I didn't do that because
Oh,
now that's technical detail I have. Everyone has it
right,
on this call anyway, but it wasn't necessary,
right.
and it wouldn't have helped.
I also liked the idea of finding sort of where your boundaries are in terms of fiction and reality, because like I am writing slightly outside my experience, writing a character who is an aerobatic performer. I will do my research on the aircraft that I intend to use because somebody who has flown that aircraft will read my book. And so I don't want to disrespect them and get that information wrong. But there are places where I just sort of create, like I have created an air park in a fictional island off the coast of Georgia that is based on a real island, but that doesn't exist. And so like you find the ways in which to fictionalize things to tell the story that you want to tell without disrespecting actual expertise, or actual, skills that people take most of their lives, like you're talking about the police procedural stuff. I mean, those paramedics, the SRT team, they work really hard to develop that expertise, and you don't want to disrespect that. So
That's right.
I thought that
It
was
was
great.
really important to me. I mean, if you've read my books, you know that they're set in a place called Exeter, which is fictional, and at an airport called Exeter International. The actual setting is based on Chicago, Illinois, and Exeter International is based on Midway, which is where I was based for many years. But I did not want to be limited by Chicago or Midway Airport. Just like you, Liz, don't want to be limited by a particular air park. So, when you choose something that is real to write about, there are some limitations. And even though some of the best fiction writers write beyond those limitations, they typically take, some criticism for it. And the most perfect example is a contemporary novel by the name of American Dirt, where the author Jean Cummings took an unbelievable amount of criticism because she wrote about a story world which she did not live in.
I had very robust discussion about this book with my friends because I really enjoyed the story.
Mhm.
And there are
Well,
many
she
things.
took a
I
lot.
know.
She got a lot of criticism. They had to pull her book tour.
She was silenced. Like
she was completely silenced.
Yeah.
She was criticized
Yeah.
for writing about a culture that she was not a member of.
I know.
And
I know.
And I didn't care for the book, but I thought she had every right to write it. I mean, if you can't make things up, if you can't become other people, what's the point of writing fiction?
Well, we're in a very sensitive place in terms of culture right now. And as
I agree with that.
yeah, in another conversation, I am also writing a Black female pilot. So I am very sensitive to that. She's not my main character, but she is the main influence on my main character. And so
And in
that
my
is
third
something I've agonized over for years.
Well,
So,
in my third book, I'm writing a female Muslim pilot.
yeah.
And I have had several people try to talk me out of that, and I'm writing her.
It's a scary place to
I'm
write
writing her.
outside your cultural context right now. You just have to be as respectful as you possibly can be.
I agree.
But thank you for the presentation. Do you guys have any questions? Becky Kardon,
Or
thank you for
comments? Or
joining
comments?
us. Yeah,
Does
or
anyone-
comments.
Does anyone want to, thank you, Liz, for amplifying some of the points that were made and adding some different examples. I mean, the idea of being able to create the feeling of motion in fiction, that's a very interesting exercise. And I do hope we hear more about it. But do any of you, you're all pilots and writers, do any of you have anything to add?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily adding something, but I had a friend who was writing a fictional novel and it included a scene with a helicopter. So she asked me for some information on it. Now, this is a helicopter I had absolutely no familiarity with. In fact, there was a Russian helicopter. So I researched it, and then I did find online some little avenue to some people who had flown this type of helicopter, and I proposed these ideas to them, and they told me certain specific things like, oh no, that absolutely wouldn't have happened, or whatever. And then I took what the technical things were and changed them, but then I felt like I had absolutely great latitude with the characters and what they did with the helicopter. And man, I had such fun with that she loved it. I mean, basically it's ended up in the novel.
And that's what writing fiction is all about.
That's creative writing.
However, if that was my own story, I never would have felt that comfortable going with it like that.
Well, I think
know.
practice does that for you. You know, you have to.
Well, as all of you know, Fly Girl, my first novel, is based on something that actually happened to me. I had to decide whether I was going to write the real story, or I was going to fictionalize it. And I had many, many, many good reasons for fictionalizing it. So I did. And I could change, I could change the facts, I could change the names, I could change the places, the order of things, who lived, who died. I could do all of that if I fictionalized it. And that's why I fictionalized it.
I think that raises the question that's a good segue into how you deal with that, Robin, is you're taking elements from your life and then fictionalizing it. Can you expand more on that, please?
Okay, well, first thing, I will do it briefly, but I would also suggest that you check out on the website the presentation I did a few months ago on novel versus memoir, where I discuss it in great depth. I will tell you, I had a terrible, really difficult employment experience, which is what Fly Girl, the story of Fly Girl is based on. When I became the first female pilot in a small and very tight-knit corporate flight department, and really, really put a lot of obstacles in the way of my success. It was such a bizarre and awful experience. It was almost like, I like to say, truth is stranger than fiction, and this was stranger than truth. The characters were so vibrant, they practically wrote themselves. I mean, there are no real names used in the book, but all the characters are amalgam of real people. I also wanted, frankly, to do two really important things that I couldn't do if I wrote a memoir. One was include some of the stories of my friends who had come up at around the same time and incorporate them to create the authentic atmosphere of what it was like to be a female pilot in that environment. And I also wanted to change the ending because the ending was catastrophic for me. But I didn't want it to be catastrophic for my main character because I wanted her to continue on in a positive fashion. And I took a lot of criticism for I gave her a win at the end of the book, but not a big spectacular, save the world type of win. Which is what everybody wants to read these days. So I had my editors all said I had to give her a bigger win in my second book, which I did. And I think everyone will be pleased with the ending of the third book, which is, by the way, the only part of the third book that I'm absolutely sure about is the ending. But as long as I have that, I can write the rest of it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I made it was a very specific choice. I may write a memoir one day. I may write the real story, but I was very pleased with my choice. And I'm not going to lie, I was pleased with the way it worked out.
And sorry, and so when you're writing these characters and you're thinking about, I don't know, Bob or Sean or
Right.
Jamie, and then, when you open a book and it says these characters are not based or whatever that disclaimer is, how do you kind of resolve the two?
Well, they're
I
they're inspired by, but they're not exactly. Like, for example, there's someone who dies in the first book. The character on which he is based is still alive.
I think you resolve it by saying this is a work of fiction.
It's a work of fiction, and that's the disclaimer that's what that disclaimer means. Listen, I can't. It's a really interesting point. There's an antagonist in the book, and his name is Ed Dieter, and he is based on several different people, but primarily one person. And about 4 or 5 months ago, and I see all the signups to my website and to my newsletter. I get a sign up, and I took one look at the name on the email address, and I said, "That's him." It took him a while, but he finally found the book. There is no way he would pick up that book and not see himself in it. But I'm not using his name. I'm not describing him exactly. I'm not telling the exact story. What could he do?
Right.
Say
Right.
People who don't know this was me would hate me if they knew this was me. I mean, it's it's a non-starter. It's a non-starter, Jennifer.
Thank you, Robin. Oh, sorry. I just want to quickly mention, thank you, Robin, because maybe that's what I wanted to hear. You just validated what I really wanted to hear.
True story. He popped up out of nowhere after 25 years. Yeah.
And so we talked about that specifically in great detail in that that presentation that she mentioned, and also in the one that we did with our lawyer friend. So there are two presentations in the Aviatrix writers room that kind of talk about the choice between memoir and fiction, writing real events, and what legally you're at risk of if you decide to go the true story route. And so we have a pretty robust conversation, and Becky is involved in that too, because she's made the decision to write fiction as well. So, well, thank you guys for joining, and thanks especially to Robin, as always, as repeated showing on our discussions and participation in the Aviatrix Writers Room, the Aviatrix Book Club. I really appreciate that. And I'm also getting feedback from people about how much they appreciate it too. So thank you for your time. And for anybody watching, if there's a topic that you'd like to lead or explore in one of these writers' room discussions, we're going to give Robin a break for the near future and hopefully have some new facilitators, new hosts, and talk about some new stuff, and she can come and join in and chime in like the rest of us do on hers. So please send me a note either on social media at Literary Aviatrix or an email at aviatrixbookreview@gmail.com. And thank you. Robin, do you have any last words?
If anyone wants a copy of this presentation for their personal use only, please email me. or email Liz and she'll pass it on to me, or find me on social media. To be honest with you, I have like 4 different email addresses and I'm on every single social media platform. So if you cannot find me, you're not really looking. Oh, hi, Kitty. Lorraine's Kitty is there. And if Kitty needs a copy, he can have it as well. So let me know. And until next time, thank you, Liz, for this invitation. It's an honor to present to this group.